it, and everything was ratified and all that on that day. And that's why we celebrate July 4th. But now, I want to back up now on July 2nd. And remember the very day that they voted to separate from Britain, that there were some things already in the works. So you remember King George was already upset. And he was kind of a hothead, I guess you could say. It was his way or the highway. And if he got any resistance, I mean, it was off with your head. You know, that was the time frame that they lived in. But so on July 2nd, there was a British force that was already landing in New York, on Staten Island. There was already British forces landing there on July 2nd. And this was... And by the end of August, so we're talking about the first part of July, and then by the end of August, where Staten Island is, I don't know how many of you are familiar with New York at all, but Staten Island, Manhattan, Brooklyn, the Bronx, I mean, it's pretty close proximity, relatively speaking, when you're talking about geography. So by the end of August in Brooklyn, they had amassed about 20,000 British troops there. So they were establishing a beachhead, if you would, in order to squash the colonists and the colonial armies, the Continental Army, and this new Congress, the Continental Congress that had formed. And the guy's name that was commanding this was General William Howe. That was his name that was leading those troops there. So 20,000 troops there in Brooklyn, and George Washington had 8,000. So it was 20,000 against 8,000. And they were relatively in the same area. And in New Jersey, I think this is where George Washington was with his men, and they were in New York, and of course that's just across the river. All right, and so right there. So, and then August the 27th. So again, the end of August, Howe, the British general, he attacked, and the Continental Army was driven back. And then the final charge would have really finished them off, but the charge never happened. And the reason behind the charge never happening, why would you not finish off the army? Why would you not do that? Have you heard this story? Okay. And the reason that it was never finished off was because there was a rainstorm that happened to come up. And the army couldn't solidify their ground, and it kind of disrupted what they were doing, and they couldn't have that final charge. And I want to read some verses here. Mark 4:41. Somebody read that. I'm going to give you a few more to look to read. Who's getting that one? Somebody raise your hand. Okay, Tommy. All right, I want somebody to get Psalm 135, verse 7. Who wants to get that one? Okay, Allison. And Jeremiah 10:13. Who wants that one? Okay. All right, so who's got Mark 4:41? You got it?
And they feared exceedingly and said one to another, what manner of man is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?
Okay, so we all know this story, right? This was the disciples were crossing the Galilee, the Sea of Galilee. The storm came, and they were fearful for their life. You remember that? And then Jesus gets up and calms the storm, and they're astonished because the wind and sea obey him, right? And I want you to remember that. The wind and sea obey. All right, and then who had the psalm one? Okay, Allison?
135, verse 7, right?
Yes.
He causeth the vapors to ascend from the ends of the earth. He maketh lightnings for the rain. He bringeth the wind out of his treasuries.
Okay, now vapors, what is that talking about? What could that be talking about? Huh? Okay, fog. It also mentions lightning, and there was something else mentioned in there. The wind was in there also. So the wind, lightning, fog. So, and this is talking about God controls these things. Now, who had the other one? That was Jeremiah 10:13. Yep.
When he uttereth his voice, there is
So again, basically the same thing in Psalm there. Uh, so let me ask you a question. Who controls the wind, the rain, the lightning? Who controls all that? Who's in charge of all of that? All right, so as we're reading through, and I'm giving you some of these accounts, I want you to remember that. There have been other accounts. If you will read soldiers' accounts many times, they would be praying in the midst of battle, and things just happen miraculously, that is unexplainable. You can see this sometimes in some Israeli battles. If you want to go and read something very interesting, go look at the Six-Day War. Go read that, the Yom Kippur War. This happened in recent years, in the 60s, I think it was, 60s and 70s, maybe somewhere right in that range. And you will see some things that God did that are just amazing. And so as we're thinking about this, so I told you this one. So that last charge that was supposed to finish them off didn't come because of a rainstorm and this thundering and lightning and all that sort of thing. And they did not finish that last push, which gave Washington enough time to get his troops back across the river. All right, so escaping annihilation, literally. And let me back up here. So he retreated, and he retreated actually across the wide river to unite, a half-mile wide river, to unite with other forces in Manhattan. And then by the morning, the Americans had crossed, leaving some that were surely to be killed. So by the next morning, so the rain comes, they couldn't do that final push, and then by the next morning, to get 8,000 people across a river, a half-mile river, is not an easy task. So they're having to do it in boats, and come back and forth, hauling troops over. And so by morning, there was just a handful of troops left, and really those troops would probably would have been killed. But guess what happened? The morning, fog rolled in to cover the retreat of those men, and they were able to completely retreat and get back across the river. And so, again, who controls fog? Who controls rain? Who controls that? Now, you can think some of the, and I'm going to read you about 2 or 3 more of these, but you can think that these things were coincidence, but I don't think it was, because, again, how did America, how did it begin? We've talked about this. They began thanking God. Remember that? By bringing them here and through suffering. And they were actually, their goal was to minister and to witness to the Indians and to the natives. Remember that. And they did win some. And, of course, through history, and then there were other things where the English came and began to take land, and it kind of hurt that relationship. And remember that America began to get in decline because they were being successful. They were getting rich because of trade and the resources that were here, and they began to be successful, and they started turning away from God. And then the Great Awakening happened, correct? And then the Great Awakening, they turned back to God, changed culture, everything, and then there was taxation, and people started rising up against the tyranny. And so this is what led us to this point. So, and the fog did not lift until all the men were safely across the river. Is that interesting? I think it is. And one of the British began to nickname Washington as the cunning fox. I don't know if you've heard that term before, because he would not ever engage their main force head on. He would always hit them from the sides, or it would never be a frontal assault like that. He would always try to get them at a weak point or something like that. And if you remember the battle tactics back then, it was basically line up across a field, and you march, and whoever had the most bullets and who could stand the longest and had the most men, that's the one that would win. But Washington played a little different, and he would attack from the flanks and the sides where they were not. And anyway, he earned the name by the British, calling him the cunning fox. And at the end of the year, so remember we're at the end of August. By the end of that year, which is 1776, many of the enlisted people in the Continental Army the enlistments were ending. In other words, their contracts were up, their service was up. And so if Washington was going to make any moves, it had to be before all the enlistments, before soldiers were gone, basically, before that deadline came. And so this is, again, a tactic that he used. He crossed the Delaware unsuspectingly to attack some mercenaries of the British. By the way, these were German Hessian. I don't know exactly how you pronounce that, but there were, let me think here. I think there was 30,000 of them. Now, I don't think they were all in this one place, but there were 30,000 German, let me say it again, Hessians that were mercenaries that Britain had employed to come and fight against the colonists and to fight against the Continental Army. But anyway, so Washington crossed the Delaware. You all remember the painting, right? The painting. He's at the front of the boat and he's crossing the Delaware, and and all that with the flag waving in the back. I don't know if it happened exactly like that, but you know the painting. At least I hope you do. And so he's going across with his army, and he does it secretly. He crosses the Delaware and catches them off guard. It was actually Christmas night, and they crossed the river. And guess what happened as they were crossing the river? If you remember in the painting, it will maybe show some snow. I don't remember exactly. I didn't pull that up in my study. I just remember it from history, from my mind. But it began to snow and it began to hail during that crossing. And because of that, these German soldiers could not see them crossing the Delaware River. It obscured their sight, and they could not see them coming. And because of that, it was a complete sneak attack, and they were able to. They took 1,000 of those German Hessians prisoner on that particular battle. And but anyway, it was a sneak attack. It lasted for 45 minutes, and they took 1,000 prisoners. And again, there were 30,000 of these German auxiliary soldiers that were hired by the British Crown to fight the Continental Army during the American Revolution. There's another general I want to tell you about, and this is probably one you see in movies more often. So we talked about General Howe in the north, right? He was leading the Northern Army that was right there around Brooklyn and all of that, and so they were having some skirmishes and that kind of thing. And then you had General Charles Cornwallis. How many have seen the movie The Patriot? You'll remember that name, and it's Lord Cornwallis. He was very arrogant, very pompous, very prideful, and again, that would be his downfall. But he marched to Trenton and to capture Washington and his troops, and he was ordered to do that, and or encouraged to do that. And he said, this is what he said. He said, "I can bag that fox in the morning." You remember the name that was given by the cunning fox. He said, "Oh, I can bag that fox in the morning." There's no big hurry. I got this, but he never did. Washington slipped by his troops in the night. He passed through their troops in the night and got by them. It's pretty wily, if you can get thousands of troops by an army of thousands and without being seen. And then, they did finally, in that little encounter, they did encounter some British troops, and they fired at Washington from 30 yards and missed. George Washington is known by the Indians and by others for being a person that could not be shot. And there were, as a matter of fact, I mentioned this movie. If you get a chance to go see it, I would encourage you. Young George Washington that just came out just maybe a month or so ago. If you see that, there were Indians that were firing at him, and the Indians supposedly had guns that never missed. All right, they were excellent marksmen. And then when he actually finished that particular battle in the movie, there were actually bullet holes, and this is a true story. There were bullet holes in his coat and clothing, hat, everything else. As a matter of fact, he was picking bullet fragments out of his hair, and that kind of thing. And so these are documented things. But he was never wounded, never injured, and so the Indians they thought that he had some kind of what's the word? He was deity. The deity was looking out for him. You know, God was looking out. Even the Indians had that. And now you had the British that basically experienced the same things. They couldn't hit him. Now, why? I don't know, you know. What do you chalk that up to? You know. So anyway, so he got by Lord Cornwallis or General Cornwallis, and so let's stop for a minute. Do you think? And I've given you a couple stories here. Do you think the storms and the fog and the rain and the hail? Do you think those are coincidence? All right. So tell me what do you think was behind all of that? Okay. And you'll even see at times when weather, you remember I told you that the rain, it came and they could not advance. So it would hinder the British Army at times and help the American Army at times. And so you see that over and over. And so again, the hand of God kind of leading and guiding and protecting and steering. You can kind of see that a little bit behind the scenes just by some of the weather things that were going on. So let's fast forward a little bit. We're now into December 1777. All right, at Valley Forge. This usually is taught in history. I think I was taught this in history as a I don't know, middle school, high school, something like that. But Valley Forge in December 1777, the Continental Army was tired, cold, weary, and hungry. They didn't have the provisions that they needed. As a matter of fact, some of them did not have boots. Some of them did not have coats. And this is wintertime in the northern part of the United States. How many's ever been to New Jersey, New York in December? All right, how cold does it get there? All right, without a coat, how cold would it be? Without boots, how cold would it be? And here they are, and this is part of the army. They were not provisioned as they should. And really what they were eating was something that was called fire cakes. Anybody ever heard that? This was one of their staples. All right, and basically it was wheat or cornmeal mixed with water and cooked over a fire. That's all it was, and that was something that just helped sustain them, to put something in their belly. And by February of 1778, they were down to their last 25 barrels of flour. Again, with thousands of soldiers, they were down to just that little bit. And then, while at the same time, they're cold, they're hungry, they're weary, unprovisioned, starting to not have enough food. And in Philadelphia had fallen to the British at this time, and they were back in Philadelphia in warm houses with plenty of food. And a lot of the Continental Army began to lose hope because of this. You know, I mean, they were struggling, and it was a difficult time. Again, Valley Forge. And then in the early 1800s, I'm fast forwarding a little bit, there was a biographer who records something about this time. In the early 1800s, a biographer of Washington, Mason Locke Weems, you can go look him up if you want to. He was a biographer, wrote about Washington. And then he also wrote about Isaac Potts, who was a Quaker. This is where Washington was lodging at Valley Forge, okay? He was staying there in this man's home. And this man, Isaac Potts, he happened to run across Washington while he was in a grove, and he had tears running down his face, and he was crying out to God for aid. And I'm quoting here, in this crisis of country, of humanity, and the world. And so this is how Isaac Potts, this Quaker, found George Washington was out in a grove, and he was praying with tears running down his face. So he, and Potts was moved because of it, this Quaker where George Washington was staying, and declared that God would surely bless such a man and his cause. It makes you want to, you hear a lot of things about history, and you hear a lot of things about some of these early forefathers, but you don't always hear this type of stuff, and I wanted you to hear it. And then after that winter, things began to improve for the Americans, all right? There was a fellow by the name of, I'm throwing out names here, so if you want to write some of these down, you can go and study them. But Baron von Steuben, he was a Prussian-born army officer. he arrived, and he began reforming the Continental Army from farmers and plowboys into a military machine. In other words, by training, proper military training, instead of just, learning as you go. Okay, and so this was the guy that came in and helped turn that. And by May 1778, the French began to join the war also against the British. And again, and this was through volunteers and supplies. So they would send volunteers over, they would send supplies over, and again, this is something that the Continental Army needed very, very dearly. And they came in just at the nick of time. And then also they ended up bringing ships. Those are going to be important here in just a moment. So you remember General Howe in the north, and then General Cornwallis was in the south. But General Howe was replaced by Henry Clinton, General Henry Clinton, and he led the troops from Philadelphia. Howe was kind of stationed in Philadelphia because it had fallen. And then Henry Clinton took them from Philadelphia to New York, and Washington was right behind him, which ended up being a battle at Monmouth, New Jersey, and so they ended up battling there, and during that battle, one of the American field commanders ordered a retreat. The Americans did for the Continental Army to retreat. George Washington was there and stepped in, and he began to regroup the ones that were retreating and the ones that were still fighting, and rallied them together, and regrouping and pushing forward and making that battle to be not a win on either side, but more like a draw instead of a rout. And so that battle ended in a draw, and this is the last time that both major forces would face each other. All right, in the Revolutionary War. There were other battles, but this is the last time that the main forces would engage each other. And so it was understood that the British would not be able to win the North, so they turned their attention to the South, and that also did not go well. If you remember names like this, like Francis Marion, anybody remember that name? All right, what was his nickname? Swamp Fox. All right, Swamp Fox. That was his name. And actually, if you remember the movie, the Patriot, it's based on a character like him. He was a militia guy that would fight from the trees and kind of taking over, what do you call it, supplies coming in and all that kind of thing from the enemy. And but anyway, so Francis Marion, he would do stuff like that in the South, and then there was a Major General Nathaniel Greene in the Continental Army, and he made a statement that said this. He says, "We fight, get beat, and then we rise to fight again." And so this was a continual thing that was ongoing. They just didn't give up. Again, the Battle of Cowpens. Anybody know where the Battle of Cowpens was? That was in South Carolina, so now we're getting closer to home here, right? So that was a battle that took place in South Carolina, where Cornwallis pursued the Continental Army to finally eradicate them. The Continental Army was fleeing. Daniel Morgan was the one leading them in, and he was trying to lead them across the Carolinas into Virginia where there was safety. And there were several rivers that had to be crossed, some of these that you will remember. When they reached the Catawba River. How many's ever heard of the Catawba River? When they reached that river, Lord Cornwallis was 2 hours behind them, and they still had to cross the river. They began to cross, and a rainstorm blew in when they crossed, and the river became so swollen that the British Army could not cross behind them, and they had to wait 2 days to even cross because the river was so out of its banks. That just a storm that happened just like that. And then they came to the Yadkin River. How many's heard of the Yadkin River? I mean, okay, we're close to home now, right? And again, it was too swollen to cross, and but they had already crossed, and it got swollen. The Continental Army had already crossed, and it swelled to where the British Army couldn't catch them again, and they could actually see them across the river. all right, across the Yadkin. So again, he's still pursuing, and then they come to the Dan River. And by the time they got to the Dan River, it was already swollen. The Continental Army arrived, and it was already swollen. But there was a group of farmers that were sympathetic to the Continental Army's cause, to the American cause, and they got all their boats together and ferried them back and forth to help them get across the river, and they did. And by the time that the British Army got there, all of the boats and all the farmers and all of the Continental Army was already on the other side of the river. And so they kept chasing, but it seemed like it reminds me of almost like when Israel was coming across the Red Sea. You remember that? And then God comes and gets behind Israel and in front of Egypt, and they couldn't get through that cloud. They couldn't get through that cloud. And so it reminds me of something like that. But again, who controls the weather? Okay. And so, all right, so in October of 1781, so the battles kept going on. The War for Independence was over in October of 1781 in Yorktown, Virginia. And Cornwallis surrendered to the American and French forces. There was actually a large force that was supposed to, ships that were supposed to come down to rescue Cornwallis and his troops and take them back to New York, but they were cut off by the French ships that had came and already surrounded that area, and so they had put a blockade in, and the British troops couldn't get through. And so now Cornwallis and his army was kind of entrapped by the Continental Army and French volunteers and the French Navy, I guess you could say, that were by the sea. Now, if you remember in the movie The Patriot, now I don't think everything in The Patriot is historically accurate. I'm not advocating that, but there are some truth to some of those stories. At the end of that movie, you will see exactly what I'm telling you is that it's played out, where he finally has to surrender because they're beaten, and they're not going to beat the Americans and the French. And now, if it hadn't been the French, I don't know how it would have played out. But again, God works all of that together, I believe. And he also, Lord Cornwallis, this tells you the type of man he was. He did not surrender his sword personally. He sent a subordinate to surrender his sword. So he didn't even face the enemy. He said, hey, go out there and surrender. It's time to surrender, okay? So he sent somebody else out to surrender his sword. And then the British signed the Treaty of Paris September 3rd, 1783, and that is when America became an independent nation, and the British recognized it as such. And then the British, and in Washington, after that point, George Washington released his senior officers, and this was his statement. He says, "Our past days have been filled with glory and honor." And it says, "I hope your future days will be the same." And so if somebody were to ask you, and again, I'm pretty much done with the information I want to give you tonight, but there's some discussion to be had here. So if somebody were to ask you, how could you prove that God was in the forming of America? What would you say? Protection of the troops?
Through the weather, crossing of the rivers.
Yeah. I mean, the timing of that was just perfect, I mean, it was. And these are documented things that you can go look up that actually transpired. So anything else? What would if somebody says, all right, so the people today that's saying, oh, America is not a Christian nation and it was not founded on Christian principles, how do you refute that? Okay, but there's more than that. Even they were most of them, and the ones that weren't were not against Christianity, and that's a big deal. That's a big deal. Even and we even went through a lot of the politicians early on, the governors, and what they were pastors. A lot of those were pastors. Some that served in Congress were pastors. And so there were a lot of Christian influence, and when it came to creating laws, when it came to governing the colonies, when it came to that. Now, what about our documentation? And we went through that last week. What about, what was some of the phrases used in the Declaration of Independence? Endowed by our Creator. What does that lead you to? Is that promoting evolution? No, it's not. They're admitting that there is a Creator and that people have rights because that's how God created them. And there were some other phrases in there, but that's a main one, that the Creator, yeah.
I was reading that there was a study done on autobiographies and other texts that the Founding Fathers wrote, and 35% of the quotations that they used were directly from the Bible.
It is. I came across the same, and I might have said that last week or something, but yeah, but I think yeah, that is true. The quotations that they're using in documentations and letters and that kind of thing, 35% of their quotations are directly from the Bible.
I think you said 70, was it 76 House members were clergymen?
Maybe. That's one of those numbers I don't know. 7%, I know.
Maybe it was 7%.
Okay, 7%. I don't know the exact number back then, if they had the same number we have today, but there were 7% of the original Congress were pastors. Anything else? So if that question comes up, anything else so far? Let's go back a little further. When the Pilgrims got here, and the Quakers got here, and the Puritans got here, what were they doing? What was their motive? What was their purpose for coming? They were. But all right, so that's one. They were trying to escape, but also they had a mission. What was their mission? To set up a country with religious freedom, and also while they were doing that, what were they actively engaged in? They were witnessing to the Indians. And at one point, there was over 3,000 Indian converts to Christianity. And so you had missionaries that were working. You had people that came over. Translators, yes, all of that. So when you hear these statements that are out there, and you may hear it in school, the kids may hear it in school now, I don't know. But when you hear it on the news, there is a push to rewrite history. There's a push. And don't buy into it. Don't believe it. All right, know what true history is, because the idea, and I told you this, the sentiment is if they can change history, they can change the future, and we need to make sure that our children know and understand what the real history of our nation was. It is, we may get into slavery, and that was part of it, but we even talked about a free black man being a Minuteman. A free black man, and I don't remember his name off the top of my head, but he fought, and he was at several battles, several things, and lived through that, and went back to work with his original slave owner that freed him. You know, so anyway, a lot of good history, a lot of good information that lets us know that, look, people want you to believe that our nation is just a horrid place. Go live somewhere else, I promise you. Go live some. Look, I've been to lots of other countries. If you go to somewhere else, you will be vastly thankful for what God has here, what you have here. Our nation is blessed beyond measure, and we don't even recognize it. If you live in America, you're in the top 1% of the world. The poorest person in our nation is better off than some of the good off people in other countries. And I've been early on, this has been years ago, but I was in Honduras where if you made $5 a day, you're rich. Now, and that hadn't been that long ago. That's been 20 years ago, 20, 25 years ago.
That I listen to sometimes, he immigrated here from India when he was young, and he asked his daddy why he wanted to live in America, and he said, I want to live in a country where the poor people are fat.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. We really don't realize how good we have it, and I'm going to tell you, it's not because we have just worked hard, and I'm not discounting hard work. That's not what I'm doing. But the major reason that our country is so blessed is because, look, it started out with serving the Lord, hunger for the Lord, serving Him, getting the gospel out. And I will tell you even now that the United States is probably the biggest sender of missionaries that the world has ever seen, and probably even still so. And so that still goes on, and I will tell you that the blessings that we have is because of the blessings of God on our country and on our life, and that's why it's how it is. And so, questions on anything we talked about? Anything? All right. How many want to go to South Africa with me in a couple of weeks? No. I think Lori and Robin, I think they've had a good time. I think they've been